March 15, 1944. Inside the drab concrete halls of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Intelligence Center, Commander Itsuzo Kurihara hunched over another intercepted transmission that refused to yield its secrets. For nearly an entire day, Japan's premier cryptographic team had attempted to untangle what they believed to be U.S. Marine Corps tactical traffic from the Marshall Islands campaign. The rhythm, cadence, and timing of the transmissions all matched American battlefield messaging. Yet the content sounded like nothing in their extensive archives of Allied communication patterns. They tracked how these messages often preceded American attacks with uncanny precision. They mapped frequency changes consistent with Marine Corps operational habits. And still, not a single syllable made sense. The transmissions flowed like language, but no known tongue. Every linguistic weapon in Japan's arsenal failed to penetrate the mystery. The facility under Kurihara's command was no small operation. The OI Communications Unit employed 600 specialists and contained over 100 radio receivers paired with nationwide direction-finding stations. This was the same network that had unraveled U.S. diplomatic signals, cracked British naval messages, penetrated multiple U.S. Army cipher systems, and even deciphered the U.S. State Department's Purple Code before Pearl Harbor. But now they faced something that seemed beyond human analysis. What Kurihara could not know, what no Japanese intelligence officer would understand until long after the war, was that his team had stumbled upon the only modern military code never broken. A tactical cipher that wasn't built on mathematics at all, but on human culture and a language almost no outsider had ever mastered. The origins of this code stretched not across the Pacific but into the vast mesas and canyons of the American Southwest, home to the Navajo Nation. By 1940, the Navajo language, Dine Bizad, was spoken by roughly 170,000 people across a reservation spanning 4 U.S. states, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. It was an ancient tongue shaped by millennia of oral tradition, tonal complexity, and grammatical architecture unlike any European or Asian language. Navajo was built around verbs that transformed with elaborate combinations of prefixes. A single verb stem could produce thousands of forms expressing nuances incomprehensible to English or Japanese speakers. 4 distinct tones altered meanings entirely. A minor change in pitch could convert a sentence into nonsense. The phonetic inventory included ejective consonants, glottalized sounds, nasalized vowels, and other linguistic features utterly foreign to Japanese. For analysts trained on languages with only 5 vowel sounds and limited consonant variation, attempting to parse Navajo was like trying to interpret wind moving through stone canyons. Into this linguistic world stepped Philip Johnston. Born in 1892 to a missionary living among the Navajo, Johnston learned their language as a child and grew up immersed in their culture. By age 9, he translated religious sermons. At 15, he served as interpreter for Navajo leaders who journeyed to Washington, even speaking before President Theodore Roosevelt. One of perhaps 30 non-Navajos alive fluent in the language, Johnston immediately recognized its wartime potential. In December 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, Johnston read about field exercises using Comanche as improvised U.S. Army signals. That sparked an idea. Navajo, with its rarity and complexity, might serve as an unbreakable tactical code. On February 28, 1942, Johnston demonstrated the concept to Major General Clayton Vogel at Camp Elliott in California. 4 Navajo speakers transmitted test messages while Marine officers timed their performance. Messages that took a cipher machine half an hour to encode and decode were sent flawlessly in 20 seconds when spoken in Navajo. General Vogel approved an experimental program. On May 4, 1942, 29 Navajo recruits, the first of what would become an elite group, swore in at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. Among them were men like Chester Nez, Carl Gorman, John Benally, and Lloyd Oliver. Some had endured harsh boarding schools where speaking their own language resulted in punishment. Others had grown up herding sheep across the high desert plateaus, never imagining their ancestral language would one day shape global warfare. At Camp Elliott, the 29 recruits were placed under armed guard in a secured building and tasked with forging a military code entirely within Navajo. They created terms for military concepts their language had never needed: aircraft, ships, bomb types, officers, tactics. They crafted an alphabet system with multiple word choices for each letter to defeat frequency analysis. They built metaphors grounded in Navajo culture. Fighters became hummingbirds, bombers, buzzards, submarines, iron fish, battleships, whales. Everything had to be memorable, expandable, and impossible for outsiders to decipher. They produced over 200 initial code terms, memorizing every one. No written codebook was allowed. The risk of capture was too great. As Chester Nez later wrote, "We had to speak perfectly. Our language is powerful. Misusing it dishonors everything." Their first real test came on Guadalcanal in August 1942. 15 Navajo Marines landed with the 1st Marine Division. The Japanese had cracked many Allied codes by then. Anticipating U.S. moves had become routine. But suddenly, Marine battlefield communications transformed into a series of sounds unlike anything Japan had encountered. At Rabaul, Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, educated at Stanford before the war, examined the intercepted messages. He reported that the transmissions contained clear structure, consistent syntax, and repeating patterns, yet matched no known language from Asia, Europe, Oceania, or the Americas. It was as if the Americans had invented a language overnight. Japan's response escalated rapidly. Analysts recorded hundreds of hours of Navajo messages on wax cylinders. They slowed audio, charted tonal patterns, consulted monks, scholars, and linguists. Nothing worked. Every new approach produced the same result: complete cryptographic paralysis. Meanwhile, on Guadalcanal, the code proved its worth almost immediately. On November 8, 1942, Chester Nez transmitted artillery coordinates in Navajo. The Japanese intercepted the message but could not decipher the meaning. Minutes later, U.S. shells obliterated a machine gun nest. Colonel Haruo Kanuma wrote in frustration, "The enemy employs a code beyond any system we have studied. We can no longer predict their actions." Japanese analysts soon turned to one potential solution: a Navajo captive. Joe Kiyomiya, a Navajo soldier captured at Bataan in 1942, was interrogated for months. Japanese intelligence believed he could unlock the mystery. But though Kiyomiya understood the words spoken, he could not provide meaning. The Navajo code used ordinary words in highly specialized ways only trained code talkers understood. His inability infuriated his captors. Torture escalated: beatings, exposure to freezing conditions, starvation. Still, he could only tell the truth. The messages were Navajo but arranged in patterns meaningless without training. This realization slowly reached Japanese command. They were facing something unprecedented, a code that even a native speaker could not interpret. By the end of 1943, they effectively abandoned attempts to break the Navajo system. The success of the Navajo Code Talkers at Guadalcanal spread through the Marine Corps like wildfire. Officers who once doubted the idea now insisted their battalions receive Navajo radio men immediately. Reports described the transmissions as faster than any mechanical cipher and so secure that Japanese intelligence, long accustomed to cracking American codes, could not decipher a single phrase. Their work wasn't just useful, it was revolutionary. This sudden demand led to the creation of a dedicated code talker school at Camp Pendleton. Young Navajo recruits began arriving in groups, many straight from the reservation. Some had been punished in boarding schools for speaking their own language. Now that same language had become a classified military weapon. Their training was intense. They practiced in sealed rooms while instructors blasted the sounds of battle through speakers. They crawled through sand, sent messages while wearing gas masks, and memorized hundreds of coded terms without ever writing them down. Every lesson carried the same weight. A single mistake could cost lives. As new weapons and strategies emerged in the Pacific, the code expanded with them. The atomic bomb became the metal egg. Kamikaze pilots were the death wind. Tanks turned into tortoise vehicles, and grenades were simply potatoes. Each term was logical to a Navajo speaker but incomprehensible to anyone else, especially to Japanese linguists who struggled even to distinguish Navajo's unique tones and explosive consonants. Meanwhile, Deep inside Japan, frustration grew. The Imperial Navy dedicated entire cryptanalysis teams to these broadcasts, replaying the voices of Navajo Marines again and again at half speed and through frequency filters. They charted the rhythm, the spacing, the repeated syllables, everything except meaning. One analyst described the transmissions as a structured storm of sound, clearly organized yet entirely foreign. By late 1943, Japan issued desperate battlefield orders. Capture one of these Marine radio men alive. A reward of 10,000 yen, nearly a decade of pay, was offered for their equipment. But code talkers always traveled in pairs, and their partners were trained to protect them at any cost. No code talker was ever captured with his radio or vocabulary intact. As the Central Pacific Campaign expanded, the Navajo Code Talkers became essential. At Tarawa, they kept communications flowing through 76 hours of chaotic, close-quarter fighting. At Saipan, Japanese officers who once relied on solving captured American messages suddenly found themselves blind. Every Marine order dissolved into an indecipherable language. On Poliliu, a young code talker named Jimmy King transmitted more than 40 messages while pinned down and alone, guiding artillery with flawless precision. But nowhere did the code shape history more dramatically than at Iwo Jima. The entire Japanese defensive plan depended on intercepting American messages. The underground fortress, 11 miles of tunnels, artillery rooms, machine gun nests, was designed to react instantly to U.S. transmissions. Then the Navajo voices began. Within minutes, Japanese intelligence reported total failure. The Americans had switched to a language no scholar in Tokyo could begin to understand. Major Howard Connor of the 5th Marine Division organized 6 Navajo Code Talkers to operate non-stop radio networks during the invasion. For 2 days straight, they sent message after message, enemy positions, troop movements, supply requests, air support coordinates, each delivered in seconds. They processed more than 800 messages without a single error. Not one. Their speed and accuracy allowed Marine units to advance through some of the most lethal terrain of the war. General Kuribayashi, commanding the Japanese garrison, quickly realized his intelligence system had collapsed. He could predict nothing. Every American movement came as a surprise, every counterattack too late. Without the Navajo Code Talkers, the battle for Iwo Jima would have dragged into catastrophe. Major Connor put it simply, without the Navajos, we would never have taken the island. As the war pressed deeper into the Pacific, the Navajo Code Talkers became woven into the fabric of American battlefield communication. Their networks stretched from the decks of carriers to the beaches of island assaults, from artillery command posts to forward scouts moving under enemy fire. Their presence changed the rhythm of operations. Messages that once required bulky codebooks or slow cipher machines now moved with the speed of human thought, spoken in a language only a small community on the Navajo Nation had ever mastered. The Japanese high command grew increasingly desperate. Their cryptographic divisions, once confident after early war successes, recorded every tone, syllable, and cadence of the Navajo broadcasts, feeding miles of transcript into their analyzers. They charted pitch curves, compared phonetic clusters, and mapped repeating sound shapes on oscilloscopes. Yet not a single pattern yielded meaning. One officer wrote that the transmissions carried the unmistakable structure of a language but behaved like a shifting maze. Even native Navajo speakers held in captivity were unable to help, for the code talkers were not speaking plain Navajo, they were speaking a military cipher built within Navajo, a layer of meaning concealed inside another. This inability to interpret American communications began to shape battlefield outcomes. During the Marianas Campaign, Japanese commanders watched their early warning systems fail in real time. Counterattacks meant to ambush Marine regiments instead charged into prepared defenses. Their artillery fire landed on positions already abandoned. The enemy no longer reacted, they guessed, and every guess cost them men they could not afford to lose. As fighting intensified across Saipan and Tinian, the code talkers operated around the clock in dark, sandbagged bunkers where the air smelled of sweat, field rations, and hot radio tubes. Messages never stopped. Attack coordinates, ammunition requests, evacuation routes, casualty counts. Naval bombardment schedules. Every line of communication passed through Navajo voices speaking at a pace that astonished experienced radio operators. One Marine officer observed that they handled complex transmissions so quickly, it sounded as if the words were falling over each other. Yet the code talkers felt the weight of their role. They knew a mistranslated word could send shells onto friendly positions. Many invoked traditional teachings before turning on their transmitters, reminding themselves that language carried spiritual responsibility. Their work was not mechanical, it was personal, ancestral, sacred. The Japanese, sensing their strategic blindness, attempted increasingly risky measures. Snipers were ordered to prioritize radio men. Patrols were instructed to capture Marine operators alive. Units were rewarded for retrieving radio equipment from fallen Americans. But the code talkers never carried codebooks, never wrote anything down, and never allowed their radios to fall into enemy hands. On several islands, Marines formed protective circles around Navajo operators, knowing that Japanese troops viewed them as priority targets. Even so, many code talkers continued transmitting under fire, their voices steady despite bullets striking the sandbags inches from their heads. By late 1944, the disparity between American coordination and Japanese confusion became undeniable. The enemy's intelligence networks, once formidable, had grown nearly useless. Officers could not anticipate Marine maneuvers, could not decode attack schedules, and could not intercept naval firing orders. Entire operations unfolded while Japanese commanders felt as though they were walled in fog, as one diary described. This fog became a shroud during the assault on Iwo Jima. The island's defenders depended on intercepting American messages to trigger their counterstrikes. Instead, 6 code talkers controlled the entire communication chain for the first 2 days, an unbroken relay that guided 30,000 Marines through ash, tunnels, and relentless fire. In that labyrinth of smoke and volcanic soil, their Navajo-encoded instructions created the only clarity on a battlefield designed to destroy clarity entirely. And through all of it, the Japanese continued listening, recording, analyzing, and failing. Their brightest cryptographers had broken foreign governments, infiltrated diplomatic cables, and penetrated Allied codes since before the war. Yet every hour of Navajo transmissions reinforced the same truth. They were up against a system not built from mathematics but from culture, something fluid, living, and beyond reach. By the time the American advance pushed toward Okinawa, the Navajo Code Talkers had become indispensable. Their networks formed the nervous system of the Pacific Campaign, transmitting orders faster than any machine could process, faster than any opposing force could hope to understand. Their language, once beaten out of children in boarding schools, now guided fleets, divisions, and air wings across thousands of miles of ocean. In every message, the balance of the war tilted further. By the time American forces prepared for the assault on Okinawa, the Navajo Code Talkers had become so deeply embedded in Marine operations that commanders no longer viewed them as specialists. They were the essential bloodstream through which every order flowed. Radios crackled day and night with the sound of Navajo voices, carrying instructions that moved divisions, redirected naval bombardments, and coordinated close-air support across the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The scale was unprecedented. More than 180,000 American troops, hundreds of ships, and the constant pressure of kamikaze attacks all relied on communication that could not be intercepted or delayed. The only system fast and secure enough to keep pace was the Navajo Code. The Japanese tried everything to disrupt it. Their radio units attempted voice mimicry, but the tonal shifts of Navajo twisted clumsily in their mouths. Even trained Japanese linguists sounded, as one code talker later joked, like someone gargling marbles. Electronic jamming proved equally useless. The code talkers simply shifted frequencies, maintaining clarity through chaos. When Japanese artillery bracketing threatened Marine command posts, the Navajo radio men moved without breaking transmission, slinging their equipment over their shoulders as they ran. Their messages remained clean, precise, and unbelievably fast. As the fighting dragged into its second month, the Japanese military, exhausted, isolated, and increasingly desperate, recognized a bitter truth. Their intelligence network had been outmatched not by superior machinery, but by cultural knowledge they had dismissed. Orders from Tokyo urged the capture of one of these mysterious marine operators alive, but none were ever seized with equipment intact. Their partners destroyed radios before retreating, and Marine squads defended them with fierce loyalty. Many remembered the standing order: if necessary, defend the code talker above all else, because without him, no one on the battlefield would know what anyone else was doing. Even as their voices shaped the battlefield, the code talkers carried the burden of war in deeply personal ways. They were young men from a nation within a nation, citizens of a people whose language had been suppressed for decades, who lacked basic civil rights in several U.S. states, and who returned home after each battle to the same discrimination they had left behind. Yet every message they sent was an act of defiance against the forces that once tried to silence that language. In the most violent corners of the Pacific, their words became the most powerful weapon the Marines possessed. As Japan's defensive perimeter collapsed across the Pacific, the code itself evolved faster than Japanese analysts could track. New terms flowed naturally from Navajo cultural metaphor. A flamethrower became the burning rain, a dive bomber, the swooping hawk, a tank, the armored tortoise. These words, deeply rooted in Navajo worldview, carried a clarity that made battlefield communication intuitive and swift. Complex instructions that took long English sentences were reduced to brief, elegant phrases. What would have been a paragraph of coordinates in conventional code became seconds of rhythmic, melodic Navajo. By 1945, the enemy's cryptanalytic divisions were exhausted. They had broken American diplomatic codes before Pearl Harbor, penetrated army systems, and intercepted countless military communications across the Pacific. But the Navajo messages remained impenetrable. One Japanese intelligence officer later admitted that hearing those transmissions felt as if the Americans had enlisted spirits rather than soldiers. And then, in August 1945, as the war reached its final days, a Navajo voice transmitted a message history will never forget. The words announced Japan's surrender, carried first not in English, but in the language that had safeguarded marine operations from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. The war that had begun with fire and shockwaves ended with a Navajo sentence carried across the Pacific: the enemy has laid down its arms. For the code talkers who survived, the silence that followed the war felt heavier than the battles they had fought. Their program remained classified. They could not tell their families what they had done, could not explain the dangers they faced, could not share the role their language played in shaping victory. They returned to homes where they were denied service in restaurants, where some were still forbidden from voting, where children were punished for speaking Navajo in schools, never knowing that this forbidden language had helped secure the very freedom the nation now celebrated. Many carried trauma privately. The memories of battle and the spiritual burden of using sacred language to direct destruction weighed heavily. Traditional ceremonies became their path to healing. Elders performed rites meant to cleanse the spirit after warfare, rebalancing the inner world of those who had used words, living, breathing Navajo words, to guide the machinery of war. The decades that followed brought gradual recognition. Records were declassified. Stories emerged. Surviving code talkers stepped forward to reclaim what had been hidden. Their role transformed from a classified asset to a national treasure. And as they spoke, America learned how their voices, once suppressed, became the unbreakable bridge between survival and victory. By then, the war was long over. But the echoes of their transmissions endured, shaping how a nation understood the power of language, culture, and identity. As the post-war world reshaped itself, the story of the Navajo Code Talkers drifted quietly beneath the surface of public memory, classified, unseen, and unspoken. Their radios had fallen silent, but the echoes of their transmissions remained imprinted across the Pacific, embedded in the invisible paths of victory. When declassification finally came in 1968, the world expected to see technical reports or cipher machines. Instead, it encountered young men whose greatest weapon had been their voices. Those voices now began to speak publicly for the first time. Veterans who had carried radios through bullets, ash, and jungle mud stood before audiences and explained how a language once forbidden in American schools had become the only unbroken military code in modern warfare. They spoke softly, calmly, carrying the same steady resolve that had carried them through battles. Many were farmers, ranchers, mechanics, ordinary lives built upon extraordinary service they had never been allowed to share. In Japanese archives, the truth of their impact emerged slowly. Former officers described desperate final months, frustrated mathematicians, hours of sleepless analysis, thousands of recordings without meaning. Some laughed at their own failure. Others admitted the emotional toll of facing a code that seemed immune to human effort. A few spoke with surprising reverence, calling the Navajo transmissions voices shaped by a world we could not enter. The empire that once believed itself racially and culturally superior had been defeated not only by American steel, but by American diversity. Across the Navajo Nation, recognition came with mixed emotions. Elders who had fought to preserve the language amid decades of forced assimilation now watched that same language honored as a national treasure. The young men who had served returned to communities still fighting poverty, still facing discrimination, yet holding a quiet pride that had not been permitted during the war. Some felt healing. Others felt the weight of years of silence. But all understood the significance. They had proven that Navajo was not a barrier to progress. It was a strength the modern world had underestimated. As time passed, their story became more than military history. It became a cultural turning point. Linguists studied the unique structure of Navajo, recognizing how its verb complexity, tonal precision, and cultural metaphors formed a natural shield against interception. Scholars began teaching it as an example of linguistic resilience. Young Navajo students, once punished for speaking their language, now recited the same syllables with pride, knowing those words once guided fleets and divisions. Ceremonies were held where code talkers stood next to U.S. presidents, receiving medals decades overdue. One by one, they stepped forward, not seeking glory, but honoring their people. Many spoke of their fellow code talkers who never returned from the Pacific, men whose stories remained locked behind silence too long. Their honors were offered not in triumph, but in remembrance. Even Japan, once desperate to break the unbreakable code, acknowledged the achievement. Historians invited surviving code talkers to lectures and cultural exchanges. A few traveled to Japan and stood before audiences who listened with unexpected respect. Former enemies bowed to them, not as soldiers, but as guardians of a language that had defeated a nation's intelligence machine. One code talker told a Japanese audience, "In war, our words were weapons. Today they are bridges." The applause that followed carried a kind of reconciliation neither side had imagined in 1945. But time marched forward. Each year fewer code talkers remained to tell the story themselves. Their memories, transmissions whispered through static, the smell of sulfur on Iwo Jima, the heavy radio strapped across their backs, began passing into history. The responsibility shifted to future generations. Teachers, filmmakers, veterans groups, and Navajo families carried the story, ensuring the silence that once hid their legacy would never return. The unbroken code lived on not in radios, but in classrooms, ceremonies, and the voices of Navajo children learning the songs and prayers their ancestors carried across wartime beaches. The language that once shielded Marines now protected cultural identity. The nation that once silenced Navajo now funded preservation programs. A language nearly erased had become immortal through survival, sacrifice, and service. For the men who had spoken that code under fire, the greatest legacy wasn't the messages they sent, it was the future their voices helped secure. A future where their culture endured. A future where their language thrived. A future where their story reminded the world that strength does not always come from machines, weapons, or technology. Sometimes, it comes from the quiet, steady voice of a young man speaking the words of his ancestors into a radio, carrying life or death instructions across oceans. As they aged, many code talkers said they hoped people would remember one simple truth. They were ordinary men who used the most extraordinary weapon imaginable, heritage. And with it, they shaped the course of a world war. The radios were silent now. But the code lived on, as unbreakable as ever. In the decades that followed, the Navajo Code Talkers became symbols of a deeper truth about America's wartime strength. Historians examining the Pacific War realized that victory had hinged not only on industrial might or battlefield courage, but on a cultural mosaic the Japanese military had never anticipated. Diversity had become strategy. Heritage had become a weapon. And language, the one element of identity that governments had once tried to suppress, had become the decisive encryption system of the modern era. As the Cold War began, military intelligence experts quietly analyzed the Navajo Code's success. Cryptographers concluded that no machine, no cipher system, and no mathematical algorithm could have replicated its linguistic depth. The Navajo language had emerged from centuries of oral tradition, shaped by ceremonies, stories, and generations of memory. It was not engineered for war, yet it became the very thing war could not unravel. Intelligence officers studying potential future threats often cited the Code Talkers in reports, noting that the strongest defenses sometimes came not from laboratories, but from cultures governments rarely understood. Meanwhile, the Code Talkers themselves re-entered civilian life, carrying with them memories that often surfaced only in quiet moments. They worked as teachers, welders, farmers, and public servants. A few entered tribal politics. Others lived out their days in peaceful anonymity. Many still woke at night remembering jungle heat or volcanic ash, the sound of shellfire above the steady hum of their radios. Some spoke of guilt, survivor's guilt, cultural guilt, or the moral weight of using sacred words in a war of industrial destruction. Yet most understood they had done what survival demanded. They had protected fellow Marines, defended their homeland, and preserved their people's language through the most unlikely path. In the 1980s and 1990s, academic researchers uncovered Japanese intelligence files revealing just how intensely the empire had tried, and failed, to break the Navajo Code. Reports described months of analysis, consultations with scholars, and failed attempts at phonetic reconstruction. Some documents admitted with humility that Japan's own cultural worldview had blinded its intelligence programs. Officers had expected American radio traffic to reflect Western languages, not indigenous traditions. The admission became a quiet acknowledgement of defeat, but also of respect. Across the Navajo Nation, younger generations began hearing the stories directly from their elders. School programs invited Code Talkers to speak in classrooms where children once feared punishment for their own language. Grandchildren recorded interviews, capturing memories that had remained hidden since the 1940s. Tribal elders incorporated the Code Talker story into ceremonies, honoring the balance between war responsibility and cultural preservation. For many families, these conversations became a bridge between two worlds, the ancient and the modern, the sacred and the historical. As aging veterans began to pass away, memorials rose across the country. Statues depicted young Navajo Marines with radios slung across their backs. Museums preserved original headsets, field telephones, and scuffed boots still carrying traces of island sand. At military academies, cadets studied the Pacific campaigns while learning that a handful of Navajo voices had directed movements of thousands. At one ceremony, a Marine Corps general summarized it simply, "They were not only part of our history, they made our victory possible." Some Code Talkers found themselves invited to Japan, standing before former adversaries who expressed admiration rather than resentment. In Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, they shared stories not of triumph, but of shared suffering. One elderly Japanese cryptographer bowed deeply to a Code Talker, apologizing for the war. The Navajo veteran placed a hand gently on the man's shoulder and replied, "We were soldiers. Now we are neighbors." That moment, witnessed by students and journalists, became a symbol of reconciliation born from a code that once divided them. With the passing years, only a handful of Code Talkers remained, each carrying memories heavier than any medal. They attended ceremonies when able, often escorted by grandchildren who pushed their wheelchairs or steadied their hands. Some struggled to speak, yet when they recited Navajo phrases, their voices seemed to regain the strength of youth. What had once been a battlefield weapon was now a legacy they desperately wanted preserved. As the last original Code Talkers left this world, their funerals blended Navajo tradition with Marine Corps honors. Drums echoed against canyon walls, mingling with rifle salutes and the folded flag handed to grieving families. In those moments, the story felt complete. A story not only of war, but of identity reclaimed. Today, the Navajo Code lives on in ways the Japanese cryptographers could never have imagined. It is taught in schools, spoken in homes, and preserved in digital archives. Linguists study its complexity. Soldiers study its legacy. Children speak it proudly, carrying forward a language once nearly lost. Like an unbroken thread, it connects generations across a century of change. The radios have been silent for 80 years, but their echoes still travel across time, voices whispering through history, reminding the world that victory sometimes comes not from force, but from the strength of culture, identity, and a people who refuse to let their language die. The Navajo Code Talkers did not just send messages. They became the message, proof that the greatest strength of a nation can rise from the voices it once struggled to hear.